and Bendy.
Hello and welcome to the podcast they could not stop, Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art. I'm Waldemar Janustak, art critic of the Sunday Times, and I'm joined at the wheel of this shaky charabanc of a podcast by a man who does so many things they call him the Swiss Army knife of art. He's an art historian, an art critic, a dealer, a TV personality, an art detective, a heartthrob for many, and even a farmer. On the covers of his books, they call him Bendor Grosvenor, but on this podcast, he's Bendy, the sweetest man in Scotland. Bendy, how is life on the farm?
Life on the farm is very good, thanks, Wald. And I saw you on the telly last night, so that's really cheered me up. And you're far more intrepid than I am, because there was one bit in the programme, which I really liked, Art's Most Horrific, where you were standing perilously close to a geyser which was exploding. Where was that?
That was in Iceland, and it was exploding, yes. So, in fact, there's a piece of camera that I do there where you can see the water splattering down on me a little bit if you squint. The fact is, it was boiling hot, because, of course, the geysers produce this lava-hot water, and I did very well to keep talking, I think, given that I was being burnt alive as I spoke. But I'm glad you watched it. It's an exciting film to make.
Yeah, really good. On Sky and Sky Arts, and people can do that on catch up, can they? Should we say?
It's going to be repeated a few times. You can always watch it on Now TV, which has all the Sky films, and yes, it'll be on catch up. Believe me, over the next few months, you'll have quite a lot of it repeated. You'll be able to catch me somewhere or other. But it's got great reviews, so I'm really pleased, and it's very sweet of you to mention it.
You're like the sister Wendy Beckett of Arts TV. Every 30 seconds around the world, somewhere you are on someone's screen.
But I'm not as beautiful as Sister Wendy Beckett, or indeed as handsome as you. So, I start off with many disadvantages, Bendy. But let's get right down to this, because since last week, I have been inundated with stuff about this damn swan theory of yours, and the whole idea that somehow or other Thomas Lawrence smuggled an image of a swan into his portrait of Isabella Wolfe. I mean, have you had any reaction to that nonsense, Bendy?
Oh, deluged with support, Weld. Deluged with tweets from you saying how stupid and ridiculous I am. I reckon if we ever get down to doing some live shows, right, we should kick off with a cage fight over this, because by the time this is going to run and run.
There's been a lot of reaction. Of course, we had that poll, a reader's poll in Twitter, which comprehensively came down in favour of my opinion, which is that you've been drinking too much and that you're imagining swans where they don't exist.
Yeah, your poll, which I'm going to report to the Pollster Society for misleading questions. And but still, I took some heart for that, because it was 54-45, wasn't it, roughly? So some people thought I was right, and I am going to trump all your naysaying, Wald, with endorsement from none other than the great classicist Mary Beard, who agrees with me that the swan is indeed there. So we can't be that. And now I think we should move swiftly on to the next topic.
I can't believe Mary Beard sees the swan as well. Oh, well, you can't, you never can tell, can you? Listen, Bendy, later in the podcast, we'll be looking at that fabulously rich territory of forgotten artists. There have been an awful lot of them, and we'll be picking the most important, I hope. And then for On the Wall, I've chosen something that belongs to the Tate, but I wish it belonged to me, because I really, really want it. So all that's coming up. Don't forget, everything we talk about, all the art, it's illustrated in the show notes at zczfilms.com. And as this new thing, you can watch us as well as hear us on YouTube and the film version of the podcast, which is on the ZCZ channel. First, though, find yourself a handkerchief, folks, because Bendy has something sad to tell you. It's shocking news from the art world. Bendy, shocking news. You informed me that something unexpected is happening. The National Gallery is selling off all its furniture. Is that right?
Yeah, lots of people have brought this to my attention. Do you remember those lovely red leather comfy chairs that used to be in the big galleries in the National Gallery?
Yes, the great big puffy ones that make you feel like you're in a gentleman's club.
Yeah, I love sitting down in front of all the great pictures there. Now, the National Gallery, after they rehang, they replaced them with very uncomfortable, hard wooden benches. And worst of all, they have decided now to junk and sell those lovely red comfy benches. So they are being offered at auction at a place called Bellman's Auction in only about a week's time. There's 5 of them wild. And some people are saying that the National Gallery, which of course is not allowed to deaccession any art, should keep these benches. Now, we should say they are not the original benches. So they were made in the 1980s, sort of mimicking an earlier style, but they've worn quite well. And some people are saying that it's a disgrace for the National Gallery to sell these, which, of course, the National Gallery is not really hard up after Gabriele Finaldi's successful fundraising. He's up to nearly £500 million over his directorship. So the curious thing, Wild, is that the starting estimate for the benches is only £800. So what do you think? Are you going to be bidding?
I don't think I could fit them in my house. They were huge, weren't they? Didn't they take up sort of the size of a giant kitchen table? They're big, weren't they?
Yeah, I think they're probably about sort of 3 or 4 meters long. Now,
Go happily
I'm torn about
into
this.
Bendel Grosvenor Mansion, the castle up in the borders. I mean, they'll fit there, all right.
Yeah.
But nowhere where most human beings live.
They won't fit very easily. I'm torn over this because I think it's a shame to sell them, but I really, really want one. Just because of all the happy hours I've sat on those benches contemplating great masterpieces. I really want one. And we've worked out that we can get one in our kitchen if we take out the kitchen table. So I think our family should be happy now to eat all our meals on those lovely comfy chairs. So I'm going to be tuning in, Wild, to have a little bid. The estimate's £800 to £1,200, and who knows, we might get lucky.
Oh, so we'll have that on the pod then next week, maybe. Bendy bidding for the benches.
Oh, we could, yeah. I'll press record while the auction's on. We'll see what happens.
One thing I did read about it, which I thought was absurd, frankly, is that the National Gallery said they're selling them because they are, first of all, a fire risk, which I guess is half understandable, but also because they might be full of bugs and they might infect all the other art with insects, which of course is a nonsense, because if you go around most of the museums in the world, there are perfectly workable benches that don't destroy all the art with bugs, aren't there?
Yeah, well, I quite like that idea because it might put bidders off. So we should double down on this. They're full of lice. You can see them humming with with fleas. Nobody should be bidding.
You're so right. God, I remember, now you mention it, the last time I sat on those benches, I was bitten to bits. I think they're all crawling with bed bugs, aren't they, Bendy?
Bed bugs. It's like going to a Paris hotel. Bed bugs everywhere.
Do you know what? One day we should talk about the seating in galleries, because it's actually very important, isn't it? I mean, you do need somewhere nice to sit down sometimes as you're strolling around a museum. So let's have a look at that. But that's not going to happen right now, because we have other fish to fry and other lice to catch. We're going to go on to something that I know everybody's gagging for. They can't get enough of them. They've had enough of the Booker Prize. They've had enough of the Turner Prize. They've had enough of the Oscars. They've had enough of Cannes Film Festival and all those things and the Golden Lion. What they really want is the Waldy and Bendy Awards.
The Waldy and Bendy Awards.
So Bendy, yes, I think this little item, which is about forgotten artists, I think this was triggered by a visit I made recently to Paris, where I reviewed the Georges de la Tour show at the Musée Jacquemart-André. It's a fabulous exhibition. And it occurred to me that, of course, Georges de la Tour was one of those artists who somehow slipped down the back of the sofa. He was big when he was alive, but then he was forgotten, and then he was rediscovered again a couple of centuries later. And there have been quite a few of these artists, haven't there, over the years? In fact, some really great names have been forgotten and then rediscovered. So I thought what would be very good is for you and I to run through some of these forgotten artists and just settle on the most important of them. And that most important forgotten artist will, of course, be handed the invisible statuette of the Great Waldy and Bendy Award. So I'm going to kick this off. Bendy, with an artist who I'm sure you'll agree with me should never have been forgotten, and that is, of course, Caravaggio. Now, these days, it's really difficult to even imagine that there was ever a time when Caravaggio was forgotten, but there was. He fell out of favour pretty dramatically in the middle of the 17th century, and it wasn't really until the beginning of the 20th century, sort of 350 years later, that an art historian from Italy called Roberto Longhi kind of rediscovered him. And this is the process that always involves, first of all, building an oeuvre for an artist. So you've got all this work and you're not sure who did it, but you put it together slowly. You say this picture's by him, this picture's by him. You look at the documentation and you build an oeuvre slowly. And Longhi began to do that with Caravaggio. And of course, once his oeuvre had been assembled a bit, people realised immediately, I think, that they've missed a very, very important artistic presence. And the reasons why he was missed are interesting. Maybe we'll go into that. But what I think is undeniable is that his massive influence on art, I mean, he's got to be one of the most important, influential artists who ever lived. But his massive influence on art makes it almost unimaginable that he could later have been forgotten, don't you think? I mean, how could people have missed or underrated Caravaggio?
I know, it really is extraordinary, but I'm fascinated by this process of forgetting and rediscovery. The really odd thing about Caravaggio being forgotten is that his innovation, that idea of a single light source and creating drama and what we call tenebrism in a picture, it's so identifiable, isn't it? I mean, it influenced so many schools of artists, and you can go, oh yeah, look, that's Caravaggesque. So quite how his name ever got disassociated from that whole phenomenon is really quite amazing.
The thing is, it looks so modern, doesn't it? It looks cinematic. I mean, the moods are almost Hitchcocky, aren't they? These big shadowy scenes, this drama, this use of real life faces. So they're not classicised figures, they're not idealised sitters, they're not saintly saints, they're supposedly real people, they feel real. And that was a kind of modern ambition, perhaps only properly understandable, really, again, after photography had been invented, because this whole idea of art being realistic was a kind of anathema to Renaissance art, wasn't it? And I think what happened was that for several hundred years after Caravaggio's death, people worshipped a different kind of art. So let's just take Raphael as the embodiment of that. I mean, people loved Raphael, they loved classical perfection, they loved this idea of art somehow being an improvement on real life, that it provided an ideal rather than a reflection. And then, of course, towards the end of the 19th century, that got challenged by various artists. I mean, people like Van Gogh, for instance, Gauguin, Cézanne, none of these people were realists. So they challenged the idea that art should be somehow classical and beautiful, and opened up the idea again that it could be kind of anything, really. And that opened a great big doorway through which various artists could come in, and certainly Caravaggio could come in. But this switch in taste, I think, between a love of Raphael and an acceptance of kind of realism, that's what made the rediscovery of Caravaggio possible. Now, of course, he's up there. He put on a Caravaggio show, people queue up for miles to see it, don't they?
Yeah, and I wonder if there's also something about his personality, the fact that, he murdered someone and he was considered a bit degenerate. So that probably counted against him. In fact, can I read you, Wild, a quote from Bellori, who wrote in the late 17th century, his Lives of the Artist. And he says that Caravaggio, driven by his peculiar temperament, gave himself up to the dark manner and to the expression of his turbulent and contentious nature. And because he had a dark complexion and dark eyes, black hair and eyebrows, and this, of course, was reflected in his paintings. So there's a clear sort of sense of people trying to reject the person as well as the paintings.
Yeah, and painting him in a satanic light, which, of course, these days is fabulous, isn't it? I mean, we love that, don't we? We love a bit of darkness and mystery and Satanism. Yes, I mean, that's certainly one of the reasons why he was disregarded. And yet, of course, the irony, the paradox, is that his art was so fiercely put to the service of the Counter-Reformation. I mean, the whole point of what he did, which is to make things more realistic, dramatic lighting, set stuff in the night, is to grab people's attention and to fight, as it were, fight for the church against the rise of Protestantism. So the Protestants were kind of against imagery, and the Catholics were pro-imagery, and Caravaggio was brought up into that fight, and he was indeed one of the main troops of it. So this deep spiritual mood of his work, which did so much really to reanimate Catholic art in the 17th century, was something that didn't find favour everywhere. But yeah, the fact that he murdered people, he was a drunkard, he was probably gay, certainly to some degree, all that makes him someone whom the 20th century, when it rediscovered him, had a lot more time for. So yes, Caravaggio, forgotten artist, but is he the most important? Over to you, Bendy.
Good one. Yeah, because next on our list is Johannes Vermeer. Well, can you believe that people forgot about him for over 200 years? Now, did you go to the Vermeer show at the Rijksmuseum?
I certainly did. Yes, I genuflected
Yeah.
with everybody else, going round it picture by picture.
Yeah. Well, I didn't because I couldn't get a ticket. So that just gives you an idea of what a megastar he is today. That was probably one of the most important exhibitions of the decade, really, wasn't it? So Johannes Vermeer lived in Delft, died suddenly at the age of 43 in 1675. Which gives me an opportunity to recycle one of my favourite jokes about Mozart, Wild, which is that by the time he was my age, he'd been dead for 5 years. Just to give you an idea of what a super achiever Vermeer was. Now, the amazing thing about Vermeer is that he was well known in his lifetime. He was head of the Guild of Painters, that's the Guild of St. Luke in Delft, twice in fact. And people, it's recorded that people highly regarded his pictures. He was called the famous Vermeer of Delft in his lifetime. But quite quickly after he died, his works begin to be miscatalogued. And you can see descriptions of his works, even so by the early 18th century, they're being attributed to other more famous artists. So that ties in with what you were saying earlier on about the importance of someone's oeuvre needing to be established. So one of his most famous pictures, which is the Allegory of the Catholic Faith, that wonderful picture in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Now, that was still called a Vermeer in the early 18th century. But there's a great quote about it, which says that it's almost as good as a painting by Eglon van der Neer. Now, have you heard of Eglon van der Neer?
Not till you mentioned him just then, no.
So poor old Vermeer, he struggles on until, in the middle of the 19th century, a great French art critic, one of your great predecessors, Wild, called Théophile Thoré, basically
Berger.
rediscovered him. And that's right, yeah, he has a number of different names, doesn't he? And he calls Vermeer the Sphinx of Delft. Now, Torre was very interested in trying to rebrand Dutch 17th century painting as sort of naturalistic art for the people. So Vermeer, of course, is great for that moment. And Torre is quite clever because he managed to buy several Vermeers on the cheap before he got really, really famous. Two of those are in the National Gallery now. And so Vermeer is now back on the map. But Vermeer's troubles are really only just beginning because, as you know, he famously was quite a slow painter. Only around about sort of 45 pictures are attributed to him today, or we think he only painted around about 45 pictures. And at this moment, later in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, people start chucking all sorts of things attributable to Vermeer into his oeuvre. So that muddies the waters a bit. And of course, the most famous example of this is the great faker Han van Meegeren, who I think you know very well.
Well, I know his descendants very well, and my favourite faker, of course, the great Sean Greenhalgh, Britain's greatest faker, was a kind of pupil by descent of Van Meegeren. So I know all about that business. Yes, I do.
Yeah, so Van Meegeren fooled all the leading art historians and the museums in the Netherlands of the day, and this is in the 1930s, because there was this great thirst for finding Vermeer. Now that he'd been rediscovered, people wanted more and more of his pictures. And Van Meegeren, who now we can see was a really terrible artist, nonetheless managed to successfully fool all the experts of the day with a number of terrible pictures called Vermeer. So now we've sort of shaken all that out. The oeuvre has been settled. The exhibition that you went to in the Rijksmuseum has kind of steadied the ship there and put him firmly on the map. And so Vermeer is now set as one of the great artists of the day. And do you rate him that highly?
Well, he's got something that rings my bell and rings the bell of a lot of other people, I think, which is this poetic, intense presence. There's a thoughtfulness to him. But with Vermeer, he was part of, I think, a shift in what people wanted from art. So whereas previously in the Raphael era, they wanted ideal beauty, they wanted perfection. By the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, people were after something else. And there was if you like, a growth of conceptual art. There was a sense in which the way pictures make you think, the way they impact on your emotions, became far more important. And it's tied in with notions of romanticism, of course. And so Vermeer's pictures, particularly these forlorn, sort of sad-looking young girls staring out the window, reading letters, they fill you with thoughts and suspicions of lost love. Has somebody written to her because he's far away? What they do is they animate the viewer. So they bring you, as the viewer, into the picture as a kind of conspirator or a kind of co-partner in its creation, because your thoughts about it are almost as important as what the artist is trying to say. And that, of course, preys on people's vanity. We all love to think that we understand stuff better than other people. I mean, look at your swans and things. So Vermeer presses that button. He makes you think that you're on a kind of mental wavelength with him. You understand his poetry. So I do like that. And I mean, he was a beautiful painter. Of course, the girl with the pearl earring, which is the embodiment of all that, really, has become such an iconic image that you just can't get away from it. I mean, it has to be one of the 2 or 3 most famous paintings in the world now, mustn't it?
Yeah. I have to say, my heretical thought is I wonder if the Vermeer pendulum has swung a bit too far. We've gone from he's hardly known at all to suddenly he's the most important artist of the Dutch Golden Age. I think if you offer me a choice, Wild, between a late Rembrandt and a Vermeer, I'd go for the late Rembrandt every time, wouldn't you?
I might well do, yes. I mean, I like Vermeer, but I do think I think he's more of a petit maître than a grand maître. And so, in other words, I don't think he ever deserved any obscurity. But I mean, he's no Rembrandt. Of course, he's no Rembrandt. And then who is? Nobody is.
I think just finally, before we move off from here, I think it's no coincidence that he is rediscovered in the middle of the 19th century, the later 19th century, as photography gets going. Because Vermeer famously based a lot of his technique and the way he composed the light in his pictures on using a camera obscura. So I think his art is suited for an age in which we too are conditioned to seeing the world through a lens. I mean, we do practically every minute of every day now, the way we see images, take things on our smartphones and what have you. So Vermeer is kind of tailor-made for the way we see the world, which is not too dissimilar to the way he was looking at the world too in the middle of the 17th century.
And isn't it interesting that both Vermeer and indeed Caravaggio have both been accused in their time of using optical devices of some sort, the camera obscura, other types of lenses and gimmicks. Because it is that, isn't it? It's the way that their photographic realism, that sense of it almost having the same presence as a picture on an iPhone, that is, I think, what has rung a lot of people's buzzers. So it's certainly true. It certainly isn't a coincidence that somehow or other the invention of photography plays into all this. As indeed, I think it will play in a funny way, in a different way, into my next suggestion for a very, very important forgotten artist. And that is the great, the underrated, the absolutely comet-like brilliant Georgiana Houghton. Bendor, do you know about Georgiana Houghton?
A very, very vague memory of something to do with spiritualism.
Yes. Not surprising it's only a vague memory, because unlike Vermeer, unlike Caravaggio, I mean, she was completely, utterly, totally forgotten after her death until about 10 years ago, I think it was, when the Courtauld Institute in London put on an extraordinary exhibition of her watercolours. And everybody was shocked by what they found there. So Georgiana Houghton, she was born in 1814, died in 1884, so absolutely pure Victorian presence. Georgiana Houghton was outed by the Courtauld show as the first abstract painter. Now, this battle for who was the first abstract artist, it means less today than it used to, but back in the 70s and 80s, when art was split down the middle, really, between figurative art and non-figurative art, and there were genuine battlegrounds here between, the David Hockneys and the Lucian Freuds on one side, and the Patrick Herons and the abstract expressionists on the other. Abstraction was a really big deal. People tied themselves into knots trying to agree, who was the first abstract painter? Was it Kandinsky, as most people said? Or was it Malevich, as other people said? Or was it Mondrian? There's a big battle for this mantle, this trophy of the first abstract artist. And then suddenly other stuff began to percolate out. This is really not until the beginning of the 21st century, so like in our own time, about other artists who came long before Kandinsky, Malevich or Mondrian, and who were making abstract art way back in the Victorian era. And the first of these, and in my view the greatest of them, was Georgiana Houghton. Now, what's muddied the water with her is not the imagery, because if you look at her work, it is unarguably abstraction. It's
Yeah.
waves of
Yeah.
colour, it's swirling shapes, it's twirls, lines, arabesques that don't describe anything, but which are meant to embody a kind of vision that she has, an internal vision of the forces at work in art, if you like, in life. So
Mhm.
it is abstract to look at, but she created it, she said, by listening to the gods in her mind. In other words, she didn't really paint these pictures. She was just the vehicle for transporting them from the divine realm to our corporeal realm, because it's through the gods that she drew this stuff. And this big spiritual dimension, because she was basically a spiritualist, a medium, this big spiritual dimension was thought somehow to disqualify her from this mantle of a properly abstract artist. But of course, the irony here is that Kandinsky, Malevich, Mondrian, all of them were into spiritual hocus pocus of some sort as well. I mean,
Yeah.
Kandinsky was a theosophite, so was Mondrian. So the same things that went into the making of masculine abstraction at the beginning of the 20th century was also what went into the creation 50 years earlier of this female abstraction by the great Georgiana Houghton. So she's been traduced by art history, ignored unfairly, and surely counts as an absolutely huge art historical discovery. What do you think?
Yeah, you sent me a couple to look at, and they're really extraordinary pictures. Very beautiful, very moving in a way. I wonder if the fact that she hasn't had the recognition she deserves is that, as far as I can make out, hardly any have come on the open market. So
No,
that's sort of that stops people having their ideas disseminated in a. We're so bad at objectively judging art, aren't we? That we often reach for values and the market to tell us what's good or famous or not. And she's never been through that process.
well, the reason she hasn't is because most of her work, obviously, it was unsold in her own lifetime. She had shows. I mean, she had a big show in Bond Street in 1871 of her work, 50 watercolours, abstract watercolours. But it was badly received and didn't sell. And in fact, it nearly bankrupted her. But what happened with her work is that it was piled up together and shipped out to Australia. So she ended up in the collection of the Victoria Spiritualist Union in Melbourne. And I mean, Australia is just not a great place in which to mount a comeback from, is it, as an artist? So in a way, she was sort of lost out there in the Australian outback and forgotten, which is a great shame. But all these things change, just as Hilma af Klint, the other big spiritualist pioneer, she's been rediscovered and these days is considered one of the biggest artists ever. So I think Georgiana Houghton is also on that trajectory. If any ever do come up, then
Yeah.
I don't think even you, Bendy, will be able to afford them.
I'm quite keen on this idea of a seance. Well, we should try that. There's so many artists I want to ask questions of. We should give it a go one day. We could try Lawrence and ask him about
Oh, I
that
was
bloody
just
swan.
going to say, dear Thomas Lawrence, did you manage to smuggle your swan into the portrait of Isabella Wolfe? That would be fun. But who have you got for me then? Who could possibly trump Georgiana Houghton?
Oh, I'm going to go really, really off-piste now. And in fact, this is an embroiderer from the 13th century in England, and she was called Mabel of Bury St Edmunds. Wild, and I bet you've never heard of Mabel of Bury St Edmunds.
No, I've never heard of Mabel of Bury St Edmunds. Enlighten me.
Okay, so in the middle of the 13th century in Europe, right, little plucky old England was number one top nation for embroidery. In fact, we were so good at our embroideries that it was called, generally across Europe, opus Anglicanum. It just became a generic word for embroidery, so English work, opus Anglicanum. And if, for example, you had looked in the rifled through the Pope's kind of vestments and his wonderful hangings and his things, chasubles that would have been worn in services, you would find the majority of them described as opus Anglicanum. And Mabel of Bury St Edmunds was one of the leading embroiderers of her day. So I should just quickly describe what this Opus Anglicanum stuff looks like. And we will put on the YouTube channel and a link in the show notes to an item of Opus Anglicanum, which is called the Clare Chasuble. and it belongs to the V&A. And what we see is a blue kind of tabard, which has got amazingly intricate gold stitching and threads all over it. And you see images like the crucifixion of Christ and various little scroll works and lions and various heraldic devices are all embroidered in gold. Now, Opus Anglicanum, English embroiderers like Mabel of Bury St Edmunds became especially adept at a special technique called underside couching. Are you an embroiderer, Wal? Do you know what underside couching is?
I've never underside couched myself, but I think I'm going to learn a lot about it from you any minute now.
Yeah, okay. So a lot of this embroidery is made with silk and gold and silver thread. And in order to make as much gold visible as possible, an underside couch allows you to basically stitch on the gold thread from beneath. So it's almost held in place invisibly. So the effect of all this gold and silver thread is to make everything shimmer and look sort of radiant. And what you need to imagine is that most of this stuff was designed for church and church services, altar cloths, vestments. And if you were seeing this being worn in a church, and the church is lit by stained glass windows and candlelight, then everything would have been almost magical and shimmering away. And these priests walking through would have seemed like sort of arrivals from another realm. And it's important to state that one of the reasons that we in England became absolutely superb at Opus Anglicanum is as a result of two phenomena, really. The first was sheep. So we are producing the best wool and cloths in Europe because we have wonderful rain here in Blighty, and that gives us wonderful grass, which gives us wonderful sheep, which gives us wonderful wool. And alongside that phenomenon, you have a profusion of monastic sites. And so you've got monks doing scribe work to make books, and you have nuns doing embroidery. So these things come together in around about the 13th century, and we are top nation for embroidery. Now, one of the people who was very keen at sponsoring this national skill of ours was King Henry III. And King Henry III was the first great monarch invested in the arts in this country, and he's famously responsible for rebuilding Westminster Abbey. So the Westminster Abbey that we see today is largely his creation. And he was very keen on embroidery, and he was very keen on Mabel of Bury St Edmunds. So she appears in the account rolls, for example, dozens and dozens of times. And in one instance, the king spent more than £150 in one day on embroideries. So just to give you an idea of what an extraordinary sum that is, Wild, that is more than the income of a baron in England at the time for a whole year. So he was absolutely chucking the cash on this stuff. I think that
your levels of income, that's an enormous amount of money.
Vastly eclipsing me, Wild. You can get a lot of National Gallery benches for that. But the point where we're heading to, Wild, is that the Clare chasuble, which is the item in the V&A, I think is one of the things that he commissioned. So it makes it a very, very important item. I think it was originally an altar cloth. And the really interesting thing about it, Wild, is do you see that kind of blue fabric that it's on?
Yes, I've got this picture in front of me. Indeed, a blue fabric, yes.
So this is a kind of, it's called a kansi or kutni, right? It's actually from Iran. Oh. It's Persian. And it's a mix of silk and cotton. And fabrics were brought back, of course. This is the time of the Crusades. And people are bringing back these fabrics. And one of the reasons it's embellished in this kind of Islamic scroll work is because they thought that the art of the East, Islamic art as we would call it now, was actually the art that Christ would have seen. So this stuff assumes a special importance in places like Westminster Abbey. And one of the accounts that Henry III records of his embroidery spending is to embroider in gold one of these items, one of these Persian fabrics that had been brought back from the East by the king's brother, who was called Richard of Gloucester. And we see his coat of arms on this object. So it's tremendously important, tremendously rare survival. And the person that he was, the King Henry III, was paying to do this work was a man called Adam de Basing, who was his kind of number one organizer of embroiderers. And this Adam de Basing is the person who Mabel of Bury St Edmunds worked for. So it's very, very remote possibility, but I think that Mabel of Bury St Edmunds might have made this Claire Chasuble. And this is a glimpse of not only a forgotten artist world, but a forgotten a whole genre of artisanship and craft, which has been largely lost from art history. What do you think of that?
That's absolutely fascinating. Is this stuff that you deal with in your book, the British Art book? Have you got Mabel of Bury St Edmunds in there?
Oh, yes, she's in there briefly. Henry III goes to visit her when she retires. He goes and takes her presents. It's rather sweet. He goes all the way to Bury St Edmunds to say thanks for working for me.
So people should learn more about that. Look, the thing that interests me, well, there's a few things, right? One, there's an entire millennium of British art history that has basically been rubbed out, hasn't it, because of what happened under Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries and the big switch over in England from Catholicism to Protestantism. I mean, all that destruction that followed those decisions has eradicated an entire millennium of art history. And it isn't just Mabel of Bury St Edmunds. I mean, remember that Britain used to be the leading centre of Catholic sculpture, the alabasters of Nottingham, the Nottingham alabasters. You can go anywhere in Europe now into a national museum and the chances are you'll find some Nottingham alabasters because the alabaster was high quality and the imagery was so spectacularly successful. But you can't find any in England because it's all been destroyed and damaged. So there is this, I think, a massive amount of stuff that we can yet rediscover about lost great art of Britain. So it doesn't surprise me on that level that embroidery is part of it. And the other thing that's interesting is that, of course, embroidery is and generally working with cloth is one of the things that the new art history, so the feminist-inspired art history, has been seeking to reevaluate with great success, I think, and great importance. So a lot of contemporary artists, even down to, Tracy Emin or Marina Abramovich, the people who use cloth, who make things out of cloth, women artists who previously may have been dismissed as domestic talents, have been reimagined as important artists in their own right. So I have to say that although I didn't know anything about Mabel of Bury St Edmunds, she's gone right up in my estimation. There's probably a whole thing going on in art, isn't there, of great chasuble makers who've been underrepresented and underappreciated.
Yeah. And I like to cast the net of art as wide as possible to include things like this. But you're right, we should just end, I think, with another round of condemnation for Henry VIII, because you're right, he is responsible for so much destruction. And in fact, one of the reasons why we have so little examples of Opus Anglicanum left is that after Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries and sold off all the artworks from the church, it became a fashion to reuse Opus Anglicanum works as basically bedspreads. And they got chopped up and recycled into various things. You can find a few examples left. For example, if you go to Hardwick Hall, and you'll see these chopped up bits of vestments turned into other bits of embroidery and wall hangings by Bess of Hardwick.
Tragic, isn't it? Absolutely tragic. I know that when I was searching for a wooden crucifixion to put into my Dark Ages film, there's only one left. There's only one bit of wooden crucifixion left in Britain after the Reformation. Imagine how many hundreds of thousands there were before, but there's just one bit that somebody bricked into a wall when they were hiding it in a church. I mean, it's the great national tragedy, absolute national tragedy. But I'm going to move on because we all know where we are with Henry VIII. And I'm going to move on to an artist that I know you like, Bendy, but that was, again, forgotten in extraordinarily strange circumstances for a really long time. And his name, of course, is Dominikos Theodokopoulos. And you love Dominikos Theodokopoulos, don't you, Bendy?
Yes, he's such a mouthful. I prefer to call him El Greco.
Yes, you do. And that's why everybody called him El Greco, because nobody could say his real name. So it's El Greco, born in Crete in 1541. So he was brought up in the Christian Orthodox tradition. So he wasn't a Catholic, he was an Orthodox artist, painting sort of Byzantine icons. There's very stylized Byzantine icons. And the first few images we know by him were indeed these kinds of Byzantine images of very stylized religious pictures, because at that time Crete belonged to the Venetian Empire. So he went off to study in Venice, where he encountered Tintoretto. He went to Rome, where he encountered all Michelangelo and all the great Renaissance artists. And finally, he ended up in Spain, in Toledo. And he was already well into his 30s when he arrived there. Nobody could pronounce his name, so they called him El Greco. And he started to produce this extraordinary art. I mean, it really is, which had elements of Byzantine stylization about it, elements of Venetian Tintoretto style, and elements of Michelangelo. But he came up with out of these ingredients, a completely new recipe for art. And he was massively successful during his lifetime. He became a very popular artist in Spain, much collected in Toledo in particular. But then he slipped behind the sofa again, slipped down the back somewhere, and was essentially forgotten. From the time he died in sort of 1614, he was forgotten until the beginning of the 20th century. And it wasn't until a German art historian in this case, called Julius Meyer Graf, started to write books about El Greco that he became a figure that everybody knew about. In between, he was completely ignored. And the reasons for that are again pretty interesting, I think, because they take us back to this whole idea that modern art was interested in different things from what old art had been interested in. So in the 19th century, artists, beginning with Manet, who was a kind of aficionado of El Greco, but then Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, they changed what art was about. And above all, they changed the idea that art has to be realistic, and produced art that wasn't necessarily realistic. And that, of course, opened the door for all kinds of wackier forces to appear. And one of these was El Greco. And this was all tied in, I think, as well with a kind of interesting nationalism in art, because people were getting fed up with being told that the best art in the world was Italian, and that the Italian High Renaissance in general, and above all Raphael at that time and Michelangelo, they were the epitome, they were the absolute best pinnacle of what art could achieve. So with a bit of French nationalism and a bit of Spanish nationalism, they began to return to this story and discover and rediscover forgotten artists. And I think that's the way in which El Greco came to be found again, really, by, first of all, by Spanish artists and critics who decided that they should look deeper into their past and find some of these forgotten figures. Because at that time, basically, Spanish art was looked down on as Catholic and too noisy and dark and dramatic. And apart from Velázquez, hardly anybody really was appreciated. So they discovered El Greco, and then the modern artists joined in, and then some German art historians. And finally, he came to be looked at again properly. And I think you can quite honestly say that after his rediscovery, I mean, he has to count as one of the most influential artists there's ever been. And we can go into whom he influenced. But again, it just seems to me absolutely extraordinary that he could ever have been forgotten, don't you think?
Yeah, such a talent. One of my favourite artists. Not least because I can stare at his pictures and there is still a deep sense of mystery of how he did it. So free and utterly stylistic and utterly unique. And the really extraordinary thing about him is that someone who was able to make such an impact in his lifetime, as you say, largely forgotten, and that nobody was able to follow his style and his technique because really only he could pull it off. I mean, we think art history is littered with examples of artists who come in, are brilliant and transformative, and then everybody copies their style because they set the agenda. But El Greco was so unique that nobody could do it, so they didn't try. And I think he's just an amazing artist.
But then after that he was rediscovered, I mean, he was a major influence on Picasso, for example. Picasso indeed was one of the earliest people to appreciate El Greco. I mean, he lived next door in Montmartre, well, not next door, but very near another Spanish painter called Zuloaga, so Ignacio Zuloaga. And Zuloaga was a collector of El Greco. He'd written little books about him, pamphlets. And he had this amazing painting that now hangs in the Metropolitan in New York. It's called The Opening of the Fifth Seal. Do you know it? It's amazing, strange, stirring image of St. John the Revelator. And the opening of the seal is taking place above them in the sky, and all these martyrs are about to die. Some of them are going up to heaven, some to hell. So it's an apocalyptic vision that feels as if it's painted, half of it with lightning, let alone with paint. But there's a massive influence on Picasso, above all on the Demoiselle d'Avignon. And indeed, subsequent art historians have written big theses on how the Demoiselle d'Avignon, which is generally considered to have been the most important Cubist painting ever, was massively influenced by El Greco. And you look later on, Jackson Pollock was a big El Greco fan, and as some of his earliest work, the figurative work that he did before he became Jack the Dripper, Jackson Pollock's work was massively influenced by El Greco. So we're talking here about artists who, in their second coming, as it were, turned out to be even more influential than they were during their lifetimes. And that's, that's a hell of an achievement, isn't it? No, to actually change modern art as well as the art of your times is really something special. Listen,
Yeah.
we have to decide which of these is the most important. It's almost impossible to do, but we're going to try. So we're going to give ourselves some scores for all the people we've talked about. So that's Georgiana Houghton, El Greco, Caravaggio, Vermeer, and Mabel of Bury St Edmunds. Taya, who's been quietly listening and taking all this in and absorbing it, she's going to put her scores in as well. And at the end of the podcast, we're going to decide which of them is the most significant, the most important. So that's coming up. But before then, you've impressed me so much with your knowledge, particularly about Mabel of Bury St Edmunds, that I think I need a bit of a break. So should we just have a pause for a moment or two, please, Bendy?
Yeah. Before we go to the break, well, can I make a special plea to any artists listening? Because this process of discovery and being forgotten keeps happening in art history. And one of the reasons it happens is artists are very bad at signing their pictures clearly. So Vermeer, with his tiny little curious monogram, people didn't know what it said. So artists, if you are listening and you don't want to be forgotten, sign your paintings really, really clearly with your whole name. Okay? Thanks.
And on that note, it's time for a break.
On the wall.
Hurrah! Yes, Bendy, it's on the wall, where we get to decide the things that we would like to have on our walls if we could have anything at all. And I've gone for something that belongs to the Tate. It's on show, in fact, at the moment, at Tate Modern, in a really intriguing exhibition called Picasso and Theatre. So it's a show looking at how Picasso was involved in the world of theatre and ballet, notably, of course, with Diaghilev and the famous Ballet Russe. And, of course, Picasso's first wife was a ballerina, a Russian ballerina, Olga Koklova. So he had a long connection with theatre and the world of the stage. And this exhibition uses that as an excuse, really. A kind of modern excuse for showing Picasso, because, as you know, Picasso is a difficult presence in art at the moment. He gets accused by all sorts of, particularly feminist art historians, of being the unacceptable face of macho alpha male art. So he's misogynistic, he treated women badly, he became a regressive force in art, if you like, according to some opinions today. I know I don't share those opinions, but I can't possibly deny their existence, and a lot of people think that of Picasso. So it's quite tough to put on a Picasso show that doesn't rub some people up the wrong way. And the Tate rather cleverly has managed to do that by putting on an exhibition which pretends sort of to be about Picasso and theatre, but is really an excuse to show all the Picassos that the Tate owns. And the fact is, they own lots of them. Literally several rooms full of Picassos, which you never usually see because they're never on show, certainly not all at once. So the joy here is encountering all these Picassos at the Tate that you didn't know existed, because they don't get shown very often. And in particular...
It seems extraordinary that they don't show more of them.
I know. Well,
he's a big drawer, isn't he?
He's one of the greatest geniuses that art's ever produced, I think, unquestionably. If you judge artists by the talent they have in their hands, then Picasso had so much more than most people. But he is...
Just to interrupt on this point, do you think more Picassos have gone in storage because of the issues you've been discussing, or is this just a long-standing display space question?
I certainly think that he hasn't been shown much because the Tate has favoured other types of artist. and that he certainly has
Right.
been shut down a bit. There's no question about that. Recent art historical opinion about Picasso has downgraded him massively, and the same has gone on with all sorts of artists. Gauguin, for example, you can't mention the fact that you like Gauguin anymore without being jumped on from certain circles in the art world, often because of misconceptions, I think. I mean, of course, these are people who, I mean, you can't possibly deny that Picasso was capable of misogyny and that he was a masculinist artist who treated women sometimes badly. I mean, of course, I can't deny that. It's true. But what impact that should have on our appreciation of his art is another question. And we all know where we move into when we start talking about the difference between people's biographies and the art they make. It becomes a very complicated question and a difficult topic. So I support Picasso's art totally, but I kind of understand why in the current climate people don't really want to acclaim him as much as they used to. And certainly the Tate has not had much chance or reason to show much of his work recently. But in a perverse way, that's a good thing, because it means that when it does all come out, as it has here, there's a great freshness to it. And instead of feeling deeply familiar, as one might fear may happen with Picasso, the wonderful thing about this show is that it feels really new. And the theatre angle, although it's a little bit phony and it's really basically an excuse to show all the Picassos they've got, the theatre angle does allow the show to be different. And so it isn't a predictable Picasso show. It comes at him from various angles and feels, as I said, very alive and fresh. And it's a while since I've been able to say that Picasso feels alive and fresh. But at the centrepiece of the show, the reason they put the whole thing on, I think, is what many consider to be the greatest painting in the Tate collection, which is this massive Picasso painting, which goes under various names, but it's most familiarly known as The Three Dancers. That's what it's called at the moment, although originally I think Picasso called it La Danse, so just the dance. And I think at some point or other, in one of the catalogues, I think it may have been even in the first Surrealist Manifesto, it was referred to as Three Dancers and the Devil. So it's got plenty of levels of identity going for it. Now, what it shows is it's thought of as the first surrealist painting by Picasso. So painted in 1925, or rather finished in 1925, started a couple of years earlier. It shows three figures. I think it's three. It could be four. It's one of those pictures where you can't be sure. You know what cubism's like. It throws in shapes and shadows that you can't totally interpret. So there might be four figures there, but let's say it's three, and it's a kind of man on the right with a casting a black silhouette. It's a woman on the left with a screaming face bent into a twisted posture, and then this nymphy figure in the middle of what is clearly an outstretched female nude, I think. So probably two dancers on either side of a nude central dancer, but possibly with a male figure lurking at the back. There might be a lurking figure in the window, hence the silhouette.
Yeah, there's two there, two on the right, I think.
Well,
Two figures on the right, so I would make four.
Well, you say that, but believe me, Bendy, there are so many readings of this picture that neither you nor I nor anybody else could be absolutely certain of anything about it. Picasso, for example, never said anything clear about it. He kept contradicting himself. He kept giving false information. And because he basically owned it till very near his death, I mean, he painted it in 1925, and it wasn't until the 1960s that the Tate finally managed to get its hands on it after a long campaign led by Roland Penrose, the surrealist painter and critic. A long campaign to persuade Picasso to part with it. He really didn't want to part with it. It wasn't until the mid-60s that the Tate managed finally to buy it. To great controversy, it has to be said, because the usual cast of Philistines popped up to say it's a waste of money, etc. But Picasso didn't want to part with it, partly because he knew what an important picture it was, but also because somewhere hidden within it, there are these deep Picasso-y meanings and secrets, which we'll never untangle properly, but which we might go into a little bit in our failed attempt to understand what the picture's really about. And that also takes us into this world of whether there are three figures here or four. I'm personally am tempted to see the figure on the right as a sort of agglomerated one figure rather than two figures. So I think one way you can see this picture is as a kind of threesome. So you've got a man on the right, you've got a woman on the left, and between them you've got a third woman. And I was reminded of, do you remember that interview that Princess Diana did when her marriage to Charles was falling apart? And she said something along the lines of how, with a marriage, 3 into 2 won't go. And there's a sense here of one couple and somebody else, and maybe of temptation and something going on that refers to Picasso's life, right? Now, he was married at the time to Olga Koklova, the ballerina from the Ballet Russe, and she's usually said to be the figure in the middle, because there are photos of her dancing, looking a little bit like this. But the complication is that the picture was also painted, or finished rather, just after the death of a character called Ramon Pichot. Now, Ramon Pichot was a friend of Picasso's from early on in his Parisian days. So he knew him in the 1900s, he knew him in Barcelona. Pichot had borrowed one of his studios and lent Picasso a studio. They used to be friends. And Pichot had died from a combination of syphilis and tuberculosis just before this picture was finished. And Picasso, later in one of his many gnomic statements about it, said that this painting is actually about the death of Pichot. We think, so what has that got to do with it? Well, Pichot was married to a woman called Germaine Gargallo. And Germaine Gargallo had been Picasso's lover, again, back at the beginning of the 20th century. But perhaps more significantly, she had been the love interest of Picasso's best friend, Carlos Casagemas. And I had the great good fortune of making a big film biography of Picasso, in which it was presented by John Richardson, Sir John Richardson, Picasso's great scholar who's written marvellous books on him. And we toured France and Spain and America, meeting members of the Picasso family, talking about Picasso, trying to understand Picasso's mythology. And Casagemas came up a lot because he committed suicide in tragic circumstances in 1901, principally over the fact that he had fallen in love with Germaine Gargallo, but he'd been impotent and he couldn't consummate the relationship. So when he proposed marriage to her in a cafe in Paris, she turned him down and he shot himself. Now, this had an enormous impact on Picasso, and John Richardson in particular cannot stress enough how much the tragedy of Casagemas infected Picasso's art. It was the backcloth, if you like, to Picasso's blue period, and it was something that kept coming back to him. Picasso used to say, "My art is my diary," and he used to date all the pictures, very specifically giving them a day and a month. And there's a sense in which his art was a diary. It was, if you could understand his art, you'd understand his thought processes. So somewhere in this weird triangulation, the death of Casagemas, who died because of this woman, Germaine Gargallo, whom Picasso had also had an affair with. So in other words, Picasso wasn't impotent, but Casagemas was, which filled Picasso with guilt. Later on, Pichot married Germaine Gargallo. He dies, and at that very point, Picasso, whose marriage to Olga was falling apart by this time, who'd lost interest in the Ballet Russe and Diaghilev, paints this picture. And I can't for the life of me pinpoint exactly who each of these three figures is meant to represent, right? But I'm not certain that the figure on the left doesn't have something of Olga, the screaming Olga, about her. I mean, later on, Picasso in his surrealist pictures would paint her with this screaming mouth, this kind of vagina dentata, the toothy mouth that she's got. There's something of Olga about it, and there's also something of Picasso himself about that silhouette. Now, they say it's Ramon Pichot's silhouette, but with this kind of silhouette, you can't be sure. And Picasso would later put his own silhouette into plenty of paintings that came later. So one thing that could be suggested here is that this is a picture about something that was going on between Olga and Picasso, and perhaps the central figure represents another of the women that had entered into Picasso's life. Or it might be some reference back to Casagemas and the tragic affair with Germaine Gargallo. But what I'm pretty sure about is that somewhere in here is some kind of poetic and tragic reflection on this idea that 2 into 3 won't go in a relationship, and that we're talking somehow about some personal guilts and temptations. So that's what I think. But what I'd like anyway is to persuade the Tate to give me this picture for a few years so I can hang it on the wall and really investigate it in depth and come round finally, I hope, to some kind of secure idea about what's showing here. Because the one thing that we could be absolutely certain of is that this is not just three people having a dance. I mean, it's not, is it, Bendy?
No, just having a little look at Casagamas, the fellow who shot himself. His nose, his profile is very like the silhouette on the right, isn't it? Do you think it could be him?
It could be him, and I didn't want to mention it because we're moving into Swangate territory here, where you start imagining shapes and things. But I suspect it might be. I mean, there is certainly a lack of certainty about what that silhouette is. I don't think it looks like Ramon Pichot, which is what Picasso himself said, by the way. But Pichot, every picture I've seen of Pichot, he had a big beard. And this isn't a
Yeah,
bearded
big
figure,
beard.
is it? If it was Casagamas, and if Jobin Gargallo is the other figure being lusted over and wanted, it wouldn't be a completely unexpected thing for Picasso to do. I mean, this is the thing about his art. It contains so many secrets and big emotional truths lurking in there. It's never just surrealism. It's never just cubism. There's always more to it.
Yeah, I can see the two male figures on the right could be a reflection of both Picasso and either Pichot or Casagamas somehow desiring the same woman. But a mystery, Wild. And I think that if the Tate are indeed not showing pictures like this, for whatever reason, that they should certainly allow you to have it on your wall so you can work it out for the rest of us.
You're the kindest of young men. You really are, Bendy. Oh, well, interestingly, you mentioned signatures a minute ago. You know where this is signed. Can you see where the signature, the Picasso signature, is on the picture? It's
That's a proper signature, bottom left, no mistaking it. Picasso with a big fat underline. Yeah.
indeed. But the funny thing is that he had to be persuaded to put it there. So when Roland Penrose bought the picture, finally, after years of discussion with Picasso, it wasn't signed. So he had to persuade Picasso to sign it because it was going to go into the Tate. It needed to be signed to prove it was by him. And again, Picasso needed so much persuasion. It took him ages to what now seems like a very obvious thing to do, which is sign it bottom left. But he couldn't decide where to sign it. But thankfully he did. So we know it was definitely by him. And there it is, hanging in this fabulous show at the Tate Modern, a Picasso and Theatre exhibition, right at the centre of it, in a big stage. It looks dramatic. It's a fabulous picture. Great reason to come to London to go and see this show. And then when the show's down, hopefully the Tate will indeed send it over to my place. And I'll invite you over to have a look at it too. So that's great news. But before we leave everybody here, we need to find out where we went with the forgotten artists. So that means we need to hear from Taya because she's been busily pulling out the computer and working out who said what and who gave how many points to who. So on the abacus, Taya, who's the winner? Give us it from the bottom up. Who are the best forgotten artists?
Well, today we actually have a tied bottom.
Oh.
And the tied bottom today is split between Caravaggio and Vermeer, both at 6 points each.
Caravaggio and Vermeer, the two least important forgotten artists of our age. We are so progressive. Bendy and I and Taya, we're all so progressive. What happens next?
So as number 3, it is Houghton.
Georgiana Houghton, number 3. That's low.
And then in number 2, it is Mabel of Bury St Edmunds.
Oh, Maple of Bury St Edmunds, number 2. The Chasuble
Mabel,
Queen. Oh, great.
And then
Podium.
with only 1 point more is El Greco.
Yes,
great.
El Greco, of course, El Greco. He'd started so many things. And of course, he was my choice. So once again, my choice wins the coveted Waldy and Bendy Award. But it's a brilliant choice. And anybody who hasn't been to Toledo to look at the El Grecos, you haven't lived. Get yourself over there as soon as possible because they are absolute marvels of art. Now, don't forget, listeners, if you want to see all the art we're talking about more clearly, as well as hear about it, you can look up the show notes at zczfilms.com. It's all there. Or perhaps even better still, go to YouTube and find the ZCZ channel, where you can actually watch us talking about all this on our special podcast visual stream and see everything we're talking about, see all the pictures more clearly, perhaps. But anyway, on that hopeful note, it's a goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me, and a regular reminder to help us on our plans, please, for worldwide podcast domination, to tell your friends about the show, and if you're able to, give us a little review online, only if you like it, of course. And we're both very active on social media, so please get in touch with us if you have any specific questions, and we look forward to speaking to you soon. Goodbye.
Waldy and Bendy.